we have to go back to a little bit of history to understand how things rolled out for the South American continent. Now, basically, when uh, the European settlers were looking at, you know, kind of, searching the new world, what they called, that was the terminology they used. They were seeking new world to find out, where the natural resources are, how they can, uh, collect those resources for the European continent and so on and so forth. So one of the primary difference between the European settlement which the North American continent saw and the South American continent saw is the difference of uh, the theme of the conquest. So in the North American continent, there was more of an intention of settlement and economics, whereas in the South American continent, especially in the starting years of colonization, uh, the theme was of collecting the loot and taking it back to Europe. So this was the difference between the two. Now, when in the North American continent, we see that the British settlers, especially, they actually helped in building America from the savings of the Indian colonial loot, which they had gathered over the years, over the centuries. And there was a spending model also involved in the North American continent. Whereas in the South American continent, rather than the settlers bringing in anything, the major objective was primarily to collect the loot and take it back to Europe. Now, especially the Spanish and the Portuguese conquest were very, very violent, and it was a complete economic loot of the South American continent nation. So, if we have to compare North America with South America, it would not be fair in the sense that the stage with the life cycle of the South American continent after independence started was pretty much raw and point of a kind of a zero starting compared to the North American independence and how it moved forward. So this was a primary difference in terms of where the train began its journey from. I mean, at what stage. Also, we need to see that uh, most of these South American continents had massive influence of communism, specifically because the socialist ideologies were more from Portuguese and the Spanish origin, which were too much involved with the socialist freebies and a welfare state kind of a format. So once these nations got independence, uh, the influence was more on the radical left side in terms of governance. So, despite having natural resources, I mean, we all know that Venezuela, if I'm to cite one of the example of the country, despite of the fact that they had massive oil reserves, um, you see that the position is always that of a very weak economy because all these resources were more or less went into corruption, bribery, and the strength of the economy went into the socialist freebie rather than focusing on building an economy with capitalist base. Whereas the Northern American counterpart, there was an intermingling of the British corporate sector and the aristocrat families with the North American setup for productivity for all the factors of production. So they had too much of a positive angle to it rather than the South American continent, where the angle was more about how these nations, the big powerful nations, are going to kind of create a nexus with the whoever the political leaders be. So one of the main reason why those nations which are staunchly Abrahamic in nature, staunchly, I mean, in the sense that if you talk about US, while you have bipartisan, alignment to Christianity, it is still not staunch in the sense that the individual liberties are still high. But those countries which are ruined and devastated with the colonial loot and immediately get a church supremacy over them. This kind of countries specifically are seen to be, alluding towards, um, a kind of, a financial slavery to the church, because there is an inherent, a theory running in these nations that it's the God and the church who's ultimately going to save them. So, despite having, the financial problems across the sectors and across the society, um, uh, you see that the contributions to the church are very, very high. I mean, if you are going to find out a per capita contribution of the South American population to the church, you will find it really, really very high. So, at the cost of obviously the society and the familial, um, prosperity. So, church has had that role, and this specifically comes from this theory of, staunch belief in the commandments of the Abrahamic religions, that step one, step two, step three. This is the kind of a binary which all the believers are supposed to follow, and the church is the supreme. So that kind of theology is why you find that everywhere there is a staunch following to the commandments. The opening up of the human brain is actually being dumbed down, because you cannot question anything. Commandments are commandments. These are strict commandments. So either it is a yes, or it is a no. And if it is a no, then you are not a believer. So based on that strict commandments philosophy, if there is a staunch belief in the society to follow that path, then obviously the economic prosperity is not possible, because you are dumbing down the entire natural questioning attitude of a human body. So this is exactly why such countries remain extremely poor. And you'll also see the other kinds of Abrahamic countries where you'll find in the Middle East those nations who are heavily and staunchly aligning with the Islamic Abrahamic thought process. Even they do not have stronger economies if you cut out the free crude oil reserves which came out from their soil. So I think the situation is the same. I mean, if you're talking about Venezuela as a crude oil producer, compare that with another Abrahamic friend, Saudi Arabia, which is also a crude oil producer. So that's the main pillar on which the economy stands, and that too is also not efficiently functioning. So this is what happens with all those countries who have the church and the clerics sitting on their head with strict commandments, and people believe in that kind of a theology that if you don't follow those commandments, you are destined to doom. So basically, they seek doom. Actually, I mean, you should not say this, but basically, they are trying to seek doom for themselves, because the afterlife is promised to be something of a heaven. So that is what the theory works over here, which is why the countries always remain poor.